So, to my left are two gentlemen, Jake Allen and Duarte Elvas from Sarofsky, all the way from Chicago. So let's give them a warm welcome and enjoy.
Hey, everybody.
Hello, hello. Is this guy working? There we go. Testing, testing. Very cool. All right. Well, let's begin. Thank you so much, Maxon, for having us. This is an amazing time. We are so grateful to be invited here among so many awesome artists and people, and we're really excited to share some cool stuff that we've done in Cinema 4D.
Oh, my God. It is such an honor. I mean, we're so excited and nervous and all the things.
Yeah, everything.
I mean, especially being among such an amazing lineup of presenters, and everybody's been so nice and welcoming, and it's just... it's just been incredible. So,
absolutely.
Wow, thank you.
Big shout out to Maxon. Thank you so much.
So my name is Duarte. It's pronounced Duarte, so I guess it was somewhat predestined. I am creative lead at Sarofsky, and I've been using Cinema for about 10 years now. And it sounds like a long time. It is just such an intuitive tool. I always surprised at how easy it is to create fairly complex looking visuals and so quickly, you know. And don't be fooled, I've been using Cinema for 10 years, but I consider myself a pretty basic user. I like I like to keep my stuff very simple.
Yeah.
And when I say simple, I mean like bringing some splines from AI and just throw it in
extruding
them in Cinema and that kind of simple.
Yeah.
But that's what's so cool about Cinema is that you don't need to have that expert knowledge to create some really visually striking work, you know.
Absolutely.
And that's what I love. So with pretty basic knowledge, you can actually work on Marvel title sequences and
yeah.
So, but this Jake actually dives way deeper into the software than I do, and
I mean, I'm Jake Allen. I'm a senior 3D designer and animator at Sarofsky. I've been using Cinema 4D like full time for about 6 years now. Before that, I was hopping in and out of other 3D packages, and I feel like I keep gravitating towards Cinema 4D because of what Duarte was saying. The ability to create really good-looking motion graphics very quickly, and the complexity of the systems that you can create, and the intuitiveness of the tools just makes Cinema 4D the tool of choice that we use at Sarofsky. So it's great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So right here we have our awesome space.
Yeah.
It's in the West Loop in Chicago.
All right. Shout out to Sarofsky if you're watching.
Yeah, everybody's watching. Sarofsky is a boutique design and visual effects production company. And we're pretty small. We have about 14 people full-time, and we scale up depending if we need. We'll bring in freelancers. And I think one of the things that sets us apart is that we are very much concept and design driven. And so we instill these principles in pretty much everything that we do throughout the production and post-production process. And we do a lot. We do live action, we do editorial, motion graphics, visual effects, finishing, and I mean for a variety of projects, wide range. So people know us for our main title work, and we love main titles.
Yes.
I mean, it's just so cool that these have the potential to become these iconic standalone pieces. I mean, that some people, sometimes they outlive the shows that they're made for.
They don't even remember the show.
I mean, people may not even remember the show, and they will remember the title sequence. So does that ever happen to anybody? I mean,
yeah, your work lives on.
So that's kind of cool. And we've been very fortunate to have worked with Marvel Studios on 8 of their films so far.
Yes.
So that's really, really awesome. Thank you, Marvel, too.
Yeah.
However, as we're known for our main title work, about 80% of the work that we produce is actually advertising work. So this is really our bread and butter, and we work really hard on these. Actually, we put as much effort or more into advertising. We put attention to detail. We really put as much effort into these as we do our entertainment work. So. And it's so different about advertising. They may not have that sort of that archival quality that a main title for a film has, you know, because they may be gone like after they run for a minute.
Yeah, it's like a very ephemeral medium. Yeah,
I
so
know, it's totally like
you'll
a
work really
different-
hard on it, and then you won't be able to find it on YouTube like a day later after the campaign
Exactly.
is done. So you'll be
It's
like,
just like it's gone.
yeah, but it's
So,
really
but
interesting.
We love it.
Yeah.
This is mostly what we do.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's enough to talk about. Enough talking about our work. I think
Yeah.
it's time to share this freshly cut montage that Jamie at the studio, our editor,
Thank you,
put
Jamie.
together specifically for this presentation. So
Yeah,
let's
let's
take
check
a
it
look
out.
at what we do.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
So really like a wide
Some
range
fun
of
stuff
work.
on there. Yeah, I love that.
So, but now that we've talked about the work, we've seen the work, I wanted to talk about something completely different. It's a
Yeah.
brand new, exciting, new initiative that we just started. We wanted to engage more with the community in general. So this year we started Sarofsky Labs, and these are weekend workshops. It's a weekend workshop series that covers a few aspects of motion design. Each one of them is different.
Yeah.
And it's really like a great opportunity for other creatives. We open the doors, they come in and do stuff with us, hang out.
Get to make cool stuff, basically.
Yeah.
Network, meet new people.
Exactly.
It's really fun.
And it is like a great opportunity for people to see what our workflow is like,
Yes.
what our process is. And we treat each person's project like a regular project in the studio.
Mhm.
So it's super cool. We've had 4 so far. And we have a new one coming up, I think, next week. It's
Yes.
on UI design.
Yeah.
And and actually that one is sponsored by our friends at Red
Red Giant?
Red Giant. I almost said Redshift.
No.
And
Yeah.
whoop.
Yeah.
And they're going to be giving away some freebies. So
Yeah.
I strongly encourage, if you guys are interested, to take a look at our website and learn more about Sarofsky Labs, because it's really a special initiative. And now we have
Alright.
buckets.
Yeah. So I feel like we were talking about, I think between us we have like a collective like 15 years of experience in Cinema 4D. And so we really love the software. And we wanted to do a special piece just for Siggraph that demonstrated a lot of the new features in Cinema 4D R20.
Which are now old
yeah,
news.
hilariously is old news. So, I mean, the new features in R21. But we created this animated short called Buckets. And without
Yeah.
further ado, let's check it out.
Let's take a look. World premiere of Buckets.
Yeah. All right.
Woo!
I don't know if anybody caught the Arnold render buckets at the end, but that was the inspiration for the
That was a
name.
nice
We're
little-
sitting there, we're like, what do we call this thing? Ah, buckets. Very cool.
There you go.
Yeah.
So we're going to break this down a little bit. Actually, we gave ourselves 30 days to get this thing finished. Our presentation was due on the 22nd of July, and we started concepting on the 22nd of June.
Mhm.
You'll notice we have like a whole week for, for concepting. But, you know, it is the most important part of every project,
It
really.
drives the rest
I mean,
of the
if you don't
piece.
have a good concept, you're probably not going to have a very interesting piece.
Yep.
So during this time, we brainstorm, we throw ideas out there, and we kind of figure out what we want this to be. We want this to be a fun, puppy piece, and we wanted to represent a little or reflect a little bit of what Sarofsky culture is like, and we wanted to be in our voice, but also we wanted to show the new features in R20.
Yeah.
So this time was allocated for that, and actually Aaron, our awesome boss and creative director, actually executive creative director at Sarofsky,
Yes.
found this awesome image, and it's really funny. It's the anatomy of a piñata. It was created a few years ago by the Carmichael Collective, and it's just an image that got us thinking. Got us thinking a little bit deeper about like how artists are naturally curious, you know, and how people wonder sometimes what's inside of different random objects.
Yeah.
You know, I sometimes think about that for sure.
You want to just cut stuff open and see what's in there.
And sometimes you don't, you know, you can't just go around cutting things open.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we thought it would be really fun to just kind of reimagine what would be inside of all these things.
Yeah.
You know? So what was essentially a technical exercise to begin with turned into like an exercise of creativity. You know? So, and then you'll notice that we have a week where everything looks pretty empty here around 4th of July. So you have to...
this isn't us just chilling. Yeah.
We did not just procrastinate, actually. We work full-time on client work, and we did this piece as a passion project, so we had to work around that. And and that was a short week. We all wanted to go on break for 4th of July, and everybody was really busy. So I actually came in and started sketching some stuff on the weekend of the 4th of July. We started making these thumbnail sketches, and I hope my drawing professors from college never lay their hands on their eyes on this.
They're fine.
So they look pretty hideous, but this was like the beginning of the thing kind of materializing. You know, like you start visualizing what these things look like, you get the idea across to everybody else, and so once I had this, I actually started looking at colors. I used Adobe Color, and I browsed their fashion photography section, and I started looking for color palettes or color schemes that would match the scenarios that we made up. So grabbing those, I started putting together the color story. So once we had that, I colored the storyboard, and we were ready to cut this stuff to a soundtrack.
Yes.
So we went Audio Jungle, found a cool soundtrack, and
put it all together.
Got it together. So this was really a roadmap for what the piece was going to be.
Yeah, this was helpful because we could look at it and sort of calculate timing, what was going to be needed to be simulated with rigid bodies, with soft bodies, with grains, all these different kinds of things. So the entire team of artists was looking at this sort of, like you said, as a roadmap or like a blueprint for what we wanted to do.
Yeah, it perfectly gets the idea across.
Yes.
You know, you can see it's in a lab. It's got all these viewfinder-y things and
the little things on the side.
So it definitely tells the story and gets across what the piece is essentially going to be.
Yeah.
So I handed that off to our 3D team, and people started modeling.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sourcing models.
We sort of hit the ground running when we got the animatic, and we were thinking, okay, we've got, as you can see, it starts to get into a little bit of a squeeze. So what do we have time to model? What do we have time to source? Big shout out to websites like TurboSquid and CG Trader, because it's super cool that there's so many people creating these models that enable us to finish a project like this in such a short amount of time. So things like the TV or the grenades or the shark, we were able to get models with really nice topology, and I believe they have booths here, so go say hello to them. But it was very easy for us to find the props and the objects that we needed for these scenes, and the ones that we didn't need to model, we didn't need to model. So
and it gives you a lot of flexibility, because you get to the last week and you think, oh, I don't have this model that I really need, and that's really complicated to make. So
exactly,
in 2 minutes, you buy it and you have it. So, yeah. So once you have the models, you can start simulating stuff and really figuring out what techniques work best for which ones, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so we were already sourcing models, but creating like sort of dummy geometry to just see if the simulations would work. We'd pass that over to the model, And as you can see, everything starts overlapping here because we were having a few artists do that and then building the scenes and then doing the simulations. So it's kind of like a simple sort of pipeline workflow that we had going during this entire week. And
we're getting to the last week.
It started to get a little bit more squeezed.
And
by
things
the end
start to
there.
get really overlapping.
So we were animating, we were throwing the models into look development. We had like 4 different people that were doing that kind of workflow. So getting the model, simulating it, throwing it into our scene and animating it. And then we hit the weekend.
And then we hit the weekend where we actually broke down, I think.
Yeah, exactly. This is our literal 30-day breakdown. But yeah, we rendered it and composited it.
And I was throwing like temp sounds on it.
Yes,
it
absolutely.
was nuts.
Putting it in After Effects and all
it
that
was
kind of
of cool though that on the 22nd, when people came into the office in the morning, we were able to share a piece that happened very, very, very quickly.
Yeah, it was a really big surprise. So it was very fun.
Yeah, and then a couple of days later, a little bit outside of our 30 days, we actually sent this over to our friends at Groove Guild, who did the sound design. And they did final sound for this, and it was really the cherry on top.
Yeah, thank you so much to that, because it really added to it.
Yeah. And this is the whole team that worked on the project.
Yeah. So thank you so much to everybody, especially a lot of the artists that were working on commercial projects at Sarofsky came up and said, how can I help? What can I do? And it really helped. So, I mean, I don't want us to give the impression that we take all the credit for this because so many people hopped on this, and it was
This is definitely
amazing.
like one example where the collaboration of the studio really comes through. So everybody just kind of wanted to jump in and help out.
Yeah.
And do it even outside of their work hours.
For sure. So it was very helpful. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.
Now we're going to just go through every scene and kind of show you some of the things that we learned. And now let Jake drive from now on.
Yeah, we can transition into the scene. So. Yeah, once we created this roadmap, we hopped into each of the scenes. So we're going to start with the shark, which I think is a good starting point. It's very simple. We were able to just bring the model from CG Trader into Cinema 4D, and using the modeling tools, which you've seen before in previous presentations, we were able to go into polygon mode and just cut it. So you can see we go into create tools and the line cut tool and slice. There we go. That's all we had to do with the shark. And we did it at kind of a cantered angle so you can see the inside of the shark, because we thought it would be very fun to see the jello coming out and not have these sort of straight edges that wouldn't give it that kind of depth.
Right.
So we brought that into our scene. You can see that the setup is fairly simple. We have like a cyc or just a backdrop, and if we turn off the active camera, you can see what the whole setup is like. Big shout out to Greg Smith, 3D artist who modeled the bucket. It was very nice. We got it in the style that we wanted. And we started animating the shark just using keyframe animation, having each of the sides just sort of fall with a little bit of bounce. We were going to use soft bodies for the secondary animation, but it ended up proving just a little computationally expensive. So we used one of my favorite features in cinema, which is the jiggle deformer, which literally just adds jiggle to the object. It takes the point animation and gives it springs. The cool thing with that is you can actually paint a vertex map. So you can see here the yellow is 100% stiff, and the red is the areas that we painted that we wanted to be more jiggly. So the front of the mouth, we've got the fin on the top, we got the fin on the side, and we did it for the back half too. It's very easy to just paint these on with the vertex map tools and give it a little bit more jiggle in the areas that we wanted, like the tail. So when we turn those on and we play the animation, you can see that it doesn't even have to simulate for that long. It literally works in real time, and we get a little bit of that secondary animation. So bloop, that's jiggly. What it looks like. Yeah, it's very jiggly. For the cubes themselves, we were originally going to use the shark as collision geometry, but we realized that the moving mesh was just giving it a lot of issues. So we created this sort of fake setup, which is awesome. This was just a good lesson in keeping your simulation simple. We didn't even use the shark at all. We created these 2 empty rectangles with their faces facing inward, deleted, so they had holes for them to fall out of. And we parented those underneath each half of the shark so that they would inherit that animation. And it's just a series of simple cubes that are put under a cloner, and if I hide the shark, you can see what the setup looks like. You know, the geometry is just fairly simple. So for a lot of our simulation work, we use a real flow for a lot of the things we do at Sarofsky, and we originally had a crunch. It was a time crunch. So using what we knew, we created the soft body simulation in real flow, but later on we had a little bit of time after the fact, and we're able to reverse engineer it into Cinema 4D. So by no means do you have to use real flow as the tool of choice. The soft body simulation worked perfectly fine. But we'll show you how it worked basically with Cinema 4D, because real flow and Cinema 4D interoperate really nicely, and they have a series of plugins that you can use that export your geometry with all the keyframe data, all your vertex maps, all your UVs are maintained. So this is what we used up here. We used the RealFlow SD exporter, which let us select just the cubes and the geometry that we wanted to be the soft bodies. You can see me selecting here in the video the left cubes and the blockers. And then I just add those and I export them and they come into RealFlow. So let's hop into RealFlow for a second. Here we are. And the geometry, as you can see, just imported perfectly. We added a little bit of thickness to the boxes so that it would be a little bit more stable with the simulation. But you can see that the animation comes in perfectly fine, and the cubes are in there too. So if I hide these blockers that I have and make them in wireframe mode, you can see that the cubes are in there. They get triangulated because RealFlow uses triangulated geometry for all of it. But the soft body system was actually done using particles. RealFlow has a new particle-based dynamics solver for soft bodies, and it uses the animation of the particles and constraints between them to do the soft bodies, and then it uses that almost like a mesh deformer on the geometry. So we were able to have the animation occur on the cubes. You can see I added these little pusher blocks because they weren't falling out of the cube enough. So they kind of go, and they just push the cubes out within like 24 frames. And that was nice because it only had like 1 second to show the shark. So if I hide those particles and I bring back the cubes, you can see that the animation comes back perfectly fine. And there's our cubes falling out. The really cool thing is that all of this is baked as Alembic, and since R19, Cinema 4D has had a really robust Alembic tool set, so this was a no-brainer to import and export back into the software. And we're going to do that right now. We're going to hop back into Cinema 4D, and you can see that the Alembic comes in perfectly. It's scaled for the shark. It comes down and falls outside. The tricky thing is we were thinking, how do we hide these cubes while they're outside of the shark, and then when they exit it, how do we turn them back on? So Cinema 4D now is a feature where you can take an Alembic and you can click that button in the upper left corner that's called Make Editable, and it lets you have access to the vertex data of your Alembic instead of just being one point. And because we have access to the vertex data, we can add vertex maps using the new Fields feature in Cinema 4D. So we created a vertex map using 2 box fields that gave it a 0% value when it was outside of the shark, and then when it exited, it gave it a 100% value. What did we do with this? Well, we piped this into a cutout opacity in the Arnold shader. So it's literally just invisible when it's outside of the shark, and once it exits the body of the shark, it becomes visible again. And our 3D artist, Matt Miltenberger, actually came up with this technique. He is legitimately a magician on the side.
Like legit magician.
Yeah, legitimate magician. And he came up to us and was like, it should be easy. Just make it disappear and make it appear again. And I was like, this is some next level thinking. So thank you so much, Matt, for the tips on getting that working. The next thing that we had was the inside of the shark. You could see the inside of the model, and it just looked kind of plain. The reverse texture wasn't looking very nice. So we wanted to add this kind of body on the inside. Duarte had the idea of having this gridded layer of cubes to kind of look like the organs on the inside. And this was just a breeze to create using the new volume builder tools in Cinema 4D. The way that we built it is we used the volume builder to create a smaller version of the shark. And so you can see on the inside of the shark there, we've shrunk it down. And we did that using an erode layer that is a standard for VDB modeling. And when we did it, we created one version of the shark. Then we duplicated it and we subtracted it. So now we have this sort of tube of the inside of the shark, and we chopped it with a cube. The cool thing, and this is something that we learned from the inimitable Nose Man in the Cinema 4D community, is that you can pipe a matrix object into the Voronoi fracture object, and you get this really cool kind of gridded structure that looks like the Jello cubes, but it fits the shape of the inside of the shark that we had. And all of this is procedural, so if Duarte came up to me and said, I want the cubes to be bigger, I want them to be smaller, it was just a one-click change to the size of the cube, and it would just cascade upward in the object manager. And it made it really easy to make changes for us. And so the volume builder tool set is very nice, especially from a procedural perspective. So now we're going to go to the balloon. We actually have a demo scene that we're going to show you real quick, so let me just escape out of the presentation and find my mouse and pull open not the bear, but our balloon scene. So we have sort of a stripped-down version of the balloon right here, and we're not going to talk about the cloth for the balloon or the string. There's quite a lot of really cool resources online that show you how to sort of explode it, but it's basically a cloth surface with an attractor right here set to a really high negative value. So when it blows up, boom, the balloon explodes. What we're going to talk about is the fracturing features, because that uses some of the new features in Cinema 4D R20 that are very cool. So let me hide the wind, let me hide the floor plane, let me hide the string, and let me hide everything regarding this balloon. So all we have is this inside portion. And this is a really cool technique that we originally picked up from Chris Schmidt. He does a lot of great information on Cinema 4D. But we applied it to this sort of circular shape of the balloon. And I'll go through how it works. So we have a Voronoi fracture, which takes points and creates the cracked version of the balloon. But what we wanted to do is have those cracks grow. So we have a plane effector that has the position, the scale, and the rotation turned on. And we just move the position slightly down, we scale it slightly down, and we rotate it a little bit. So when the plane effector does its thing, you can see the pieces move slightly, and it makes it look like those cracks are growing. But the way that we were able to animate that on is by putting inside the plane effector a MoGraph selection. And what a MoGraph selection is it's a tag you can add to anything MoGraph related. It can be a cloner, it can be a fracture, it can be a Voronoi fracture. And what it does is it lets you select those pieces. So inside of the tag, we've got this spherical field. And when the field animates forward, it creates this selection. So that sphere intersects with the balloon, and it creates the selection. Above the spherical field, you can now add this thing called a freeze layer. And the freeze layer normally does exactly what it says. It just freezes a selection that you make. But it's got this really cool feature called grow. And what that does is it grows the selection frame by frame outward in space. So as we continue forward, you can see that the selection grows, and everything that was brown turns yellow. The reason this is cool is because no matter where this sphere is touching, the growth will happen organically and procedurally. So if I delete these keyframes and I move the sphere to the top, you can see right here on the balloon, it'll grow from the upper left corner. Whoa. If I do it one more time from the lower left, let's just do this for fun's sake. Whoa, the cracks grow from there. So this was a really cool way that we could create a procedural setup to have these growing cracks on the shape of the balloon once it popped. Inside the plane effector, we have our MoGraph selection. We also have this thing called a delay layer, and what that does is it just interpolates the plane effector. So you start with the pieces not being scaled and moved, and normally if we've just put the selection in there, you can see that they just kind of pop. So what the delay effector does is it creates the frames in between those beginning and end versions of the plane effector and makes it a smooth transition. So when we click play, you can see that they end up scaling over time. And so the delay layer is really helpful if you want to take your plane effector and make that into interpolated frames. Lastly, we added this rigid body tag, which was fairly simple. It's just set to a rigid body so that it reacts to gravity. If you go into your project settings, though, dynamics are automatically set to have gravity on. What we did is we turned that off, and then we created a gravity force and added a linear field to it. And what that does is it goes from 0 to 100%. So when we take that gravity field and we animate it upward in the Y, everything falls organically from this sort of staggered effect, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like going upward. And that way we could get this kind of cartoony effect, almost Looney Tunes-esque, where it's like, no, and it just falls down to the bottom. So that's the balloon. So if I hop back into this presentation, that was how we achieved that effect with the balloon. And the next scene was the TV. And it actually seemed like this would be very hard, but it ended up being really straightforward. We use RealFlow for fluid stuff, and they just added a particle-based grain solver. So using the same tool set and the same workflow that we have with Cinema 4D, it was very easy for us to export this TV geometry, bring it into RealFlow, and get the grains going. And so we'll show you how that works. The first thing we needed to do, though, in the scene is crack the screen. So this was really simple. We just took the screen and ran it through a Voronoi fracture, and then we baked it down. So everything was an individual object. And all we did is select a line in the center of where we wanted the pieces to actually be rigid bodies. So we put those inside of a fracture object. So we've got our line of glass inside of a fracture object, which lets us do MoGraph selection tags to it. Why do we want to do that? Well, the rigid body tag actually has an option in the lower right corner, the upper right corner of the attributes. You can see me highlighting it right there. That lets you put a selection in there to activate objects over time. And MoGraph selections can now use fields. So by using a box field, we were able to animate that in the Y direction, much like the balloon, and have those pieces activate in a staggered sort of stair-steppy effect. So if I scrub through the timeline right here, you can see they all fall down, and they fall into the bucket in sort of this stair-step fashion. And we added a little bit of wind because we wanted the pieces to fall directly into the bucket. So you can't see it from the angle of the render, but I have this little fan just sort of blowing the pieces in there. Then we brought it into RealFlow. This was just a good lesson in keeping your simulations very simple. So we created these two cubes that represented the inside of the CRT tube on the TV, and both of their inward-facing faces are deleted, so there's a space for the grains to fill up. These two boxes below are just blockers, so that way like the particles won't fly into the inside of the geometry. And we animated it just like using the parented animation in Cinema 4D. So you can see if I highlight it in the wireframe, they have those open sides. Really super simple, and this enabled the simulation to be very, very fast in RealFlow. But to get RealFlow to generate the particles that we wanted, I had to create another cube that was just called Particle Fill. And I'll turn that on right here. It doesn't interact with the scene, but it just tells RealFlow, hey, make my grain particles here. And Duarte kept making me up the resolution of the sim over and over again so we could get finer and finer grain particles. He was telling
they look
me,
like little spheres.
Yeah, they look like spheres.
Yeah.
They look like spheres until they got small enough that they just looked like static. So with the grains on, we turn on our boxes, and you can see that with these two really, really simple pieces of collision geometry, we were able to iterate over and over again until we came up with an animation where the grains fall, and they end up in the bucket. So very cool. Well,
for the most part.
Kind of in the bucket, yeah. It was a stylistic decision. So all of these grains are also saved as Alembic, which Cinema 4D supports. So it was very easy for us to save this as an Alembic particle sequence. The only thing, though, is that it was around 600,000 particles, so it was very heavy in the viewport. And this is something that, for people who use Arnold with Cinema 4D out there, this is just a good workflow enhancement. Arnold has this thing called a procedural, which is just a proxy object, much like in Octane or Redshift or other renderers. So you can see me up here in the plugins menu, highlight the Arnold procedural. This just lets you load the geometry at render time rather than showing it in your viewport. It's a little hard to see, but there's a bounding box around the TV that just represents the volume of where those particles are going to be in space. You can see right here under the path, we just pathed it to the Alembic sequence, and it even has automatic radius settings and will create instant spheres on the animation. So it was very easy for us to keep the viewport nimble, do our animation, and then see it when we opened up the interactive preview renderer. And you can see that right here. This is Arnold's IPR open, and it's loading all of those particles, kind of sort of in real time, but basically any change that we make, Arnold was reacting spectacularly as we moved the camera around, and we were able to see what our finished product looked like without having to have the slowdown in the viewport. And I'm going to take our camera here in a second and just undo the active camera state, and you can see how quickly it moves around in the scene. I'm going to click that button. There we go. And this is just a really good workflow enhancement if you have just huge geometry that you need to bring in that you don't necessarily need to see until render time. So this was just a workflow enhancement that made it very easy for us to work inside this scene and not have to worry about keeping Cinema's viewport kind of slow. The hardest thing, though, was getting this staggered color on the TV static. We wanted to get this kind of look. And normally in Cinema 4D, you would use a color jitter node in Arnold, which works natively with MoGraph and with instances and clones and those kinds of things. And basically what you do is you give it a min and a max number for your gain and your hue and your saturation. So it's really cool. You can have hundreds of thousands of clones that all have slightly different colors and things like that. But Arnold couldn't read this big Alembic blob as separate objects. So thanks to somebody on the Arnold forums, we were able to use this rendering state node. And what it does is it gives you a bunch of variables, but the one that's important is this variable fi. And what that did is it gave us a point ID number for each of the points in the Alembic file. And in this particular instance, they're all of our particles. So by piping that rendering state number into the seed value of our color jitter, Arnold, during its rendering loop, goes, oh, cool, I see a new number for each of these particles. I'm going to shade this one this, I'm going to shade this one this, and I'm going to shade this one this. And you can see that the gain min and gain max now works. So this is just a quick workflow tip, because if you run into the same issue and you're using particles from RealFlow into an Alembic setup, this is a very nice way to get around the color jitter node. Now we are into the Boombox. This was one of our favorite scenes. It was awesome. Very fun to work with. So the Boombox was set up a lot like the Shark. We ended up using the knife cutting tools. You can see there, and you can see there, where this sort of lightsaber-esque object cuts through the Boombox. And we split it into a left, a center, and a right portion. And our designer, Matt Miltenberger, actually did this using keyframes for the center portion because we wanted to art direct the way that it fell. Dynamics are great, but sometimes you can't get the results you want right away. So as you can see, he ended up keyframing this piece hanging really slowly and then falling at the very end, which we thought gave it more of a comedic effect. Yeah. This was in turn created as a collider, so adding a rigid body collider tag to it, we could have all the instruments interacting with that centerpiece as it fell. Just like with the Shark, though, we had this tricky predicament where we were thinking, we have all these instruments that we want to come out, more that can fit inside the Boombox. How are we going to be able to do this? So one of the things that we did is we created these cubes that are just pushed and pulled so that they represent the angle of the boombox as it ends its animation. And if I zoom out on the camera, you'll be able to see we have all of our instruments sitting inside of it. So we didn't even have to have the boombox interact with the rigid body simulation at all. We were able to just create these two cubes and the center portion and have them fall out. So as you can see, as I scrub forward in the animation, the rigid bodies slide out of the boombox, and you have this like look that it's almost too many pieces for whatever can fit inside this boombox. The tricky thing, though, is how are we going to hide these objects? We could use vertex maps like we did with the shark, but the problem is the hierarchy of these objects was pretty complex. We got a lot of these models off of CG Trader and TurboSquid, so you've got buttons, you've got pieces of the horn, you've got these cymbals and this snare with a bunch of screws in it, and they weren't really playing that well with the vertex map technique. So what we ended up using was this new node in R20 called the fall-off node, and it lives in Expresso, and it actually lets you sample fields inside of Expresso setups. So not only can you drive MoGraph, you can also use something like this box field to activate its visibility in the renderer. And that's exactly what we did. We created these two box fields, and when they were outside of the boombox, their render state was set to off, and when they exited it, they were turned back on. And we'll show you what that Expresso setup looks like right here. So this is the fall-off node. It's very, very cool because you can pipe any sort of position into it, get the value of the fall-off, and then pipe that into whatever you want. So right here in the attributes editor, you can see that there's a tab called fall-off, and this is where we put our visibility cubes. It doesn't have to be a box. It could be any sort of shape that you want. But I'll go from left to right on how it works. You have your object list, which is just a list of the objects that you want to use, and it acts like a loop and goes through each one. We have our object, and we pipe the global position into the fall-off, and it gives us a 0 to 1 value. And that's what we piped into our visible in editor and visible in renderer attributes. So even when we're working in the viewport, all of those objects are hidden when they're outside of the boombox. And if we scrub through the timeline, you can see that the animation right here has them hidden. So I'll take the animation and go back and forth, and you can watch as it works fine, and their visibility is turned on and off. And this was once again another magic trick created by Matt. So we were very grateful because it added to that sort of comedic effect that there was like, how could that all fit inside the boombox? I don't even know. And we've got ourselves all of our hilarious instruments falling out. We've got the teddy bear, which we've got another demo for, which is very fun. So the teddy bear, we ended up using soft bodies in Cinema 4D. But one of the things that you learn with soft bodies, and a lot of very cool tutorials have covered this on the internet, is if you, let me just hide each of these halves. I've got the nose, the left eye, the right eye. I'm going to hide the left mesh, and I'm going to just show you our cages. So what we did is we ended up making this sort of really low poly cage around this object, which is the bear that we wanted to subdivide. So the bear will maintain all its UVs, it will maintain all its deformation, but the cage itself is the object that we make a soft body. And I'm going to show you how we did that right now. The one thing that we did do is we deleted these inward-facing polygons because it wasn't giving us that kind of hollow geometry sort of behavior that we wanted. So to select all these, there's a really cool tool called the Phong break selection, and it works at the angle of the polygon. So it basically lets me select 90-degree angle segments that I can delete. So I'm just going to select all these, and boop, there they go. They're all gone. So we've got our bear, and we've got our empty cage. What we're going to do to make this a soft body is we're going to right-click on the cage, we're going to go to the simulation tags, and we're going to add soft body. And right now, if I click play, it's just going to fall through the floor. But what we wanted to do was have the bear hang by strings. So it's starting to sound a little sadistic here, but we just really wanted it to be tied up and go, and spill its guts everywhere. So what we did is using the dynamics tools, there's this thing called a spring. And the spring is really useful, and it works with rigid and soft bodies. But what it does is it gives you a position in world space where your spring is going to be mounted. And in the attributes, it has an option to do object A and object B. We don't want to connect two objects, we just want to connect the one. So we're going to put the cage into object A, and we're going to switch it from center of mass to polygon point. What that means is under the hood, Cinema 4D has point index values for all of these objects. That's how Cinema knows what point you're talking about when you select something. Point 10, point 20, point 30. So what we can do is raise that index value, and the spring will find the point that we want. Well, what if we want to do springs on each of the arms, each of the hands? I'm just going to click play for fun so you can see. Blah. There's our bear right there. But if we wanted to create complex spring setups, we ended up using Cinema 4D's Python API. So if you're looking to do things kind of like Photoshop actions in Cinema 4D, automating tasks and things like that, I highly recommend Cineversity's tutorials on Python because a lot of this is exposed to scripts and you can tell it to do things like create a spring here, create a spring here, create a spring here. So we ended up creating a tool called Spring Break, and if I open our script manager, we have that open. We don't necessarily have to go over the code right now, but we're going to post it online. It's free, and the code is totally open, and you can check out how we did it. But basically what it does is it gets the point's position in world space, creates a spring, and then puts that spring at the same point. So what we could do is we could go into our cage, and we could highlight all the points on the arm. So let's say we want that arm to be constrained. Highlight all of these, run the script, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 springs on each of these points, and it gives you the index number. If we group them together and we call it something like right arm, we now have a group of constraints that we can move. If we click play, you can see that the bear is constrained. What we ended up doing is we did it for the back. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to click on this cage, and I'm going to highlight all of these, and I'm going to run this script and group them together. And we're going to call this back. And what we're going to do is we're going to constrain it almost like stitches. So now when we click play, we've got the back put together like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to animate this right arm. So if I minimize our script and I go into the coordinate values, I can set a keyframe by brushing and painting these keyframe buttons right here. And we're going to go to frame 24, let's do 1 second, and have it go up to the right and animate. So the fun thing about these springs is that it's all really live in real time, and you can come up with some hilarious setups to spread these bears apart. Now, how do we get this animation for the bear applied to the bear under here? This is a really cool feature in Cinema 4D called the cage deformer. And what it does, I'm sorry, not a cage deformer, the mesh deformer. I called it a cage. But if I go into the right mesh and go into the deformer menu, you'll see this mesh deformer under here. And it kind of indicates what it does by the icon. It has points on another object, move the points on a new object. So now that we have the cage wrapped around it, we add this mesh deformer to the right mesh, and then we go into the object settings, and we drag our cage into there. So let's drag our right cage into there, and click Initialize. And Cinema 4D does some things for you right now. It adds a display tag so that it makes a wireframe of the soft body, and you can see what it's doing in real time to your object. So now if we click play on our UV'd bear, we've got our bear spreading apart like so. And the cool thing is you can take this mesh and you can subdivide it using a subdivision surface. So now we've got a really nicely smoothed bear that splits apart. The fun thing is that all of these springs also have a keyframeable property called enabled. And if you go into the basic tab and you keyframe this enabled property, it enables you to break the springs. So if we click it here, we go forward 1 tab and we turn it off and we keyframe it, you can actually have the spring go boop and turn off. So what we did is we created a series of stitches basically in the front, the middle, and the top. And we were able to animate those parameters so that we could get that kind of ripping effect. So if you want to check out this script, we're going to have it on our blog at Sarofsky. And I highly encourage you to just play around with soft bodies. It's super fun. It's a great way to spend your time. So we have some more videos demonstrating what happened at the teddy bear. We've got our finalized setup here of the springs. If we go back to the beginning of the timeline and click play, you can see that we have our stitches breaking, and then we have the 2 arms on the right and the left pulling it apart. So 1, 2, 3, blah, like that. We've got some curves in the background that look like stitches. We rendered those with the hair shader. And this is where we ended up with the soft body. One of the features of Cinema 4D that we really loved was the Bake as Alembic feature. So once we had that soft body figured out, we would right-click and we would click Bake as Alembic. And what that does is it creates an Alembic file for you without ever leaving the app. So it's very nice that you can continue your workflow and you can save it while you're working. And now you have your Alembic files that you can turn into colliders because we wanted to do it in a step-by-step process. Spread the bear, add the grenades inside the bear, simulate the grenades. So it was very cool. The hair itself was pretty straightforward. Cinema 4D is a very robust hair system. And all you have to do is go into the Simulate menu and click Add Hair. But if you want to render it with something like Arnold, we'll do a quick overview of how that works. The hair objects in Cinema 4D determine the length of the hair and how many there are. So you can do 1,000,000 hairs, 150,000 hairs. Then it applies a Cinema 4D hair material tag. This does not determine the color of the hair, but it does give you access to properties like clump, kink, thickness, curl, tighten, and length. You can do a length multiplier, which is something that we used really heavily. What we did is we piped a material or a texture file into that length multiplier to tell it, don't grow hair on the eyes, don't grow hair on the nose, and make it a little bit shorter on the feet. The actual Arnold hair material, though, is the thing that's determining the way that it looks in the renderer. So we piped a texture map into the hair so that we would get those different colors on the feet, and we would get a little bit of variation in the fur. Just one caveat, though, if you're working with hair in Arnold, you always want to add an Arnold tag and make sure you have this attribute called export UVs checked. Just always remember that, because what it does is it will take the UV data from the object that it's on and bring that into the hair system so you can color it appropriately. If you don't have that on, we were sitting there banging our heads against the table saying, like, why can't we have the colors show up? What's going on? And that's why. So just always remember to have that export UVs button checked. The grenades ended up being the simplest part of this scene, obviously. So what we did is we just filled the bear with grenades using a cloner, and the physics system ended up pushing them out into the inside of the bear. We set those as rigid bodies and set it to automatic for the collision shape, created a little bit of bounce and added a little bit of mass, and now you have your grenades set up and you can see them sort of tumbling everywhere. The hair system itself is really robust and works with animated meshes too, so it interpolates those values of the moving points and you don't get the hair popping around. So that was very easy for us. And that's how we got the bear. Last but not least, we have the deer. And the deer was something similar to the bear. We ended up getting this free model off of CG Trader, and props to Tanner Wickware for setting this up, our 3D artist. He split the model, set it up on the wall, but the texture map wasn't looking so robust, so we ended up taking that system that we learned in the bear scene and applying it to the deer. So we applied a hair material to the deer and got the color information from the texture underneath. Now, the hair system doesn't automatically have the hair flow across the object, so we ended up using this hair tool called the brush and just gently brushing the hair over the deer. And I spent a good 45 minutes just brushing hair on this deer.
So satisfying.
So if you want something to do that's really meditative,
Pet the deer.
just brush hair on a deer with your object. Just add some hair and just brush it. After that, it ended up looking much better because it flowed over the shape of the deer, and it was very easy to just brush the hair all over it. So once we had the hair finished, Duarte came up with this really nice setup to split the deer in half without having to use any simulations. And this was great because you always want to, this was a lesson we kind of learned in this project, is that you always want to keep these simulations as simple as possible. It's super fun to dive in and go overboard with it, but sometimes it can make it really unmanageable. So when you have these deformers bending the deer, you don't actually have to do physics. So what Duarte did is he put two bend deformers, but had their limit set lower than the antlers and the top of the ears. So only the head would bend, but the antlers themselves would remain still and just follow the position of the bend deformer. So that way the antlers didn't look like they were bending.
Remember, really simple.
Really simple.
It's just
this
so
is
simple,
awesome.
and you can achieve a really cool effect that looks like a soft body.
Yes,
sim,
exactly.
so.
And it's super cool.
Cool.
So we ended up using this correction deformer in here, which lets us move points on the object and then blend between those movements. So what we did is we moved the points at the seam and gave ourselves a little bit of a rip. And the correction deformer actually works with fields as well. All of these deformers work with fields in Cinema 4D. So we were able to take this field and animate it from top to bottom to give it kind of this zippered ripping effect. And it was just very simple and keyframeable and art directable. So that's really the important part about using these deformers, is you can come back and say, oh my God, the deer is falling open too quickly or open too slowly. And you can just adjust the keyframes and not have to worry about the dynamic simulation. So after that, we ended up adding the objects inside the deer. But as you can see, it's kind of a complex model. So using box modeling, like you saw with Jess Herrera's presentation, Duarte created this little box model on the inside of the deer.
Oh, don't make fun of me.
it's
very
not
loosely used
It's not necessarily like the prettiest looking model, but it works really well. Duarte piped that into a cloner, and then using the volume cloning option, he said, I'm going to give this as a space where I want you to put the clones. And that made it easy because we didn't have to worry about clones sticking into the antlers, sticking into the nose area or the ears, and having the physics system freak out and be like, I don't know how to work with this. So it was very easy for us to do that just with this simple box modeling technique. So here's the cloned leaves and flower bulbs. We ended up going with rigid bodies with this simulation. When you think leaves, you think cloth, you think these different things, but the rigid body system actually has aerodynamics built into it. So you can see right here, it fills the deer, and by adding this attribute called lift in the rigid body settings, Duarte was able to get a little bit of that flowing animation that you wanted, as if they were light and they were giving air resistance push against them. So if we zoom out, this is our cached simulation. You can see as we scrub through the timeline that the leaves fall and they flow around, and the tulip bulbs themselves actually don't have any aerodynamics set on them, so they fell gently into the bucket. And it was just a really easy way for us to achieve this kind of simulation without having to worry about cloth and dynamics and all of those things sort of coming together. So props to Duarte for the amazing, super simple setup. This is great, and it's very art directable. So once again, that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this. And that pretty much explains all of the scenes that we have. So let's take a look at buckets one more time. All right,
Buckets.
and that was buckets. Thank you, everybody. So thanks again to Maxon for inviting us here. If you want to check out Sarofsky and what we do, we have an Instagram account called Sarofsky Unplugged.
And it has a lot of birthday cake pictures and puppies, and
so
it really shows what our culture is like at the studio.
And
So that's
we
cool.
have our personal Instagrams up here. It's at Duarte Elvas and at Jake Made a Thing. If you're interested in the labs, too, feel free to go to sarofsky.com/labs and come check that out and come hang out with us in Chicago. It's super duper fun, and we learn a lot from you, and you learn a lot from us, and we end up sharing a lot of information. So very cool. Thanks again, everybody, and thank you so much to Maxon. Thank you, everybody on the internet, for watching, and we hope you have a great Siggraph.
All right.